here, and well, I'm curious to see what you think about my, use of the notion of epistemic period. I definitely think I'm going to use it not in a standard way. So, let's see. Okay, so briefly, I will introduce my perspectives on Kantian theories, and probably Alex did it a little bit of that yesterday, so I'm going to try to be quick. So, in this presentation, I'm going to address four main topics. So, the role played by rationality and reasonableness for political legitimacy. I will then analyze what I call the epistemic dimension of reasonableness, and then address two specific critiques to this interpretation of the epistemic dimension of reasonableness. And finally, I will try to propose a specific reading of the basis of political equality, in which I introduce an epistemic dimension, and that's the part where I really need your feedbacks. So this is the structure. So first point, is rationality enough for political legitimacy? And then I will argue for the need for the reasonableness, because reasonableness implies that it grants reciprocity and impartiality when the citizens are actually acting as reasonable. And then I will debate the distinction between the ethical and the epistemic dimension of reasonableness. Then again, I will address these two critiques. And then I will introduce the notion of respect for person, especially for the political domain. And I will introduce the notion of recognition respect and an opacity requirement. And finally, I will introduce the epistemic dimension of political equality. Okay, so political legitimacy, the role of rationality. Okay, so contractualist tradition, and here I'm gonna give you like a reading that I think is more Hobbesian than Kantian, so probably a little bit different from the one that Alex spoke about yesterday. So the contractualist tradition, starting from Hobbes, introduced the notion of social contract among free, equal, and rational agents. And specifically, Hobbes derives the content of morality from the public agreement reached by individuals. Therefore, we can say that political legitimacy is grounded in the self-interest of agent, because cooperation is preferable just in case it solves the coordination problem and the conflict that arise in the state of nature, and if it proves to be mutually advantageous for rational agent. Okay? Otherwise, people are well off just sticking with the state of nature and their freedom to all. We can claim that morality is then an artificial concept that is publicly constructed once autonomous agents realize that it's rational for them to cooperate. And so they, abide by the contract and enter in the social system. And now we have the concept of right and wrong, but right and wrong are concepts that are abstract and we have, agree upon. And we just, not derive them intellectually. And for this reason, also the equality of individuals stems from a common rationality rather than being derived from an equal moral status of persons. So like at the beginning of the contractualist tradition, rationality sort of plays all the normative role, okay? It grounds the reason for entering the contract, and also is the reason why we are equal and we are able to construct like a moral system. Okay, so starting from this notion, like really strong notion of rationality, we can then wonder which is the best interpretation of rationality. Here I distinguish between two slightly different meanings. The first one is the basic, decision theory one, according to which an agent is rational when she tries to maximize her own interest while bargaining with others. Okay, so here, and the other one instead takes in consideration the others in a more meaningful way. So an agent is rational when she pursues her interest in a way that is compatible with other individuals pursuing their own interest. And so we can say that, in the first case, an agent reasons about the other's interest just as external factors that are gonna, change her possibility to pursue her own goals. Rather, in the second interpretation, the rational human being, it can be called also reasonable because it recognizes the fact that cooperation has a meaning in itself, because we are in a sort of intersubjective relationship, and so this second account of rationality takes in consideration cooperation as part of the deal. So a rational and reasonable citizens is aware of the other's attempts to pursue their own goals and is able to recognize their right to pursue their own goals, notwithstanding the fact that sometimes this goal conflicts with her own. Okay, and so now a little bit of story in political theory. Again, I'm going to try to be really quickly on that. Okay, so here's my interpretation of the difference of the way in which Rawls used rationality and reasonableness into his main book. So in Theory of Justice, as Alex told us yesterday very well, Rawls tried to claim that we have the possibility of selecting principle of justice that we can prove all rational agents will agree upon, granted that we abide by some idealized condition like the original position and the value of ignorance. And he defined rational agent as people that have coherent set of preferences, follow their plan, have a conception of the good, even if they don't know which kind of conception they have behind the veil of ignorance. And also they are mutually disinterested and do not suffer from envy. The fact of not being envious is really important for Rawls because he believes that people that are envious are gonna be are willing to get less for themselves insofar as also the others get less. So envy in itself is really irrational. So for Rawls, it's important that people don't suffer from envy. And so granted this definition of rationality, behind the veil of ignorance, it's possible that people will end up acting as impartial individuals moved by benevolence. He actually used the term benevolence, but the fact is we don't need to presuppose that people are benevolent inside, their, moral states. They are not virtuous as benevolent people. It's just enough for them to be rational. And once they are inside their original position, they're going to be sort of obliged to reason as benevolent. Okay, so this is the trick in theory of justice. And I believe that the pictures completely change in political liberalism because Rawls realized that, pluralism is an important fact of our life and there is conflict in policy to deal with. So starting from the here and now of our contemporary political societies, Rawls realized that rationality cannot play as much role as it was playing in theory of justice, and so he introduced reasonableness as the fundamental concept, I believe. Okay, so now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the non-ideal circumstances of politics, because again, the here and now that Rawls tried to address since political liberalism implies looking at which are the circumstances in which we have to develop our theory of justice. And there are sociological, anthropological, historical, epistemic circumstances. In this presentation, I'm going to focus more on the epistemic one, but just really briefly, I decided that these three are important to talk about. So pluralism, of course, is the epistemic one. The idea is that there are not shared standards of justice, or at least it's really hard to have a public justification to establish which are these standards. And also the appraisal of evidence is always agent mediated, because people have different comprehensive doctrine, they have different epistemic norms they apply. And so it's really hard to reconcile people on, a specific moral theory, and on which everybody can agree on. And so the upshot is that people usually have an epistemic trust in their personal perspectives, and starting with, they lack the motivation for finding a middle ground. Granted the fact of pluralism, then we have conflict, right? So it's starting from Hobbes again, we need politics because we are in conflict constantly. If we are in a peaceful relationship in a state of nature, we don't even need the state. We need the state exactly because we are in conflict. So citizens are strongly committed to their values and their comprehensive doctrine, conception of the good, and it's really hard for them to revise and change them given the fact they disagree with some others. And also there is the problem of the structure of society and power. So the political resources are not distributed equally. Some people are considered first-class citizens by default, while some others has to fight their way through, and the recognition and acknowledgement of everybody is not granted. It should be granted, but it's not, like, if we look at contemporary societies. So that's really important because it endangers the idea of political equality. Okay, so now, briefly look at what I call the epistemic circumstances. And Rawls himself talks about the burdens of judgment. That's the reason why it's really hard for us to interpret values and principles in the same way, to order them, and don't fight about the way in which we can reach them. But he doesn't want to, get too much into the epistemic analysis because he believes we're going to disagree on epistemics as much as we disagree on metaphysics, for example. So he tried to, prevent political theory to get tangled with epistemic analysis. And I think he's wrong on that because I believe we need to clarify our epistemic background before going on dealing with justification. So, okay, so I believe that at least when we talk about, disagreement for evaluative matters, we have to take for granted that the juxtaposed position, and we cannot, bracket the agent perspectives. Or at least, if we want to respect citizens that are in conflict and look at their perspectives, is always necessary. We cannot just claim to somebody, well, you're wrong, tough life, go on. We always have to take in consideration their perspective as well. And this is true, I think, because, this is pretty common in epistemology. The idea is that the appraisal of evidence is always opaque, and our appraisal of a body of evidence is never fully accessed, or not, at least is really always mediated by our perspectives. And so I believe that, I think that Rawls believe, and I believe it too, that fallibilism makes sense, at least when we, look at the theory of knowledge for evaluative matters, okay? And we can come back later on that if you think this is completely crazy. I don't know. Okay, so the upshot of the epistemic circumstances of justice is the fact that political disagreement can be defined in a very specific way, and that's the following one. So disagreement is a stable epistemic circumstance of pluralistic democracies, and disagreement is not like something that is just the outcome of the fact that fallible human beings deliberate, and sometimes they are wrong, they don't have enough information, and they just happen to disagree. The fact that we analyze the epistemic circumstances give us reason to believe that disagreement is actually the proper expression of citizens' freedom and equality, and we can have a prima facie argument in favor of democracy starting exactly from the disagreement. So, given the fact that disagreement is not a contingent obstacle, but is instead the expression of freedom and equality of political agent, then we can claim that democracy is the best method for collective decision, exactly given the fact of disagreement. So disagreement is sort of according to Rawls, is a positive fact because it's if you live in a democratic and liberal society, the freedom you have to express your own thoughts are going to propel disagreement. So the fact that there is a lot of disagreement is is like a symbol of the fact that the democracy is actually pretty working and doing his job fine. Okay, so this is a completely different perspective on disagreement with the other theory of democracy according to which we should reach the most correct solution possible, and we should try to reconcile people and solve disagreement as much as possible. This perspective is just on the other side of the spectrum, thinking that, well, first of all, disagreement is not solvable in a really democratic way, and also, it's actually there's something specific and epistemically and normatively important about disagreement itself. Okay, so political reasonableness. So with political liberalism, Rawls changed his ideas and thinks that reasonableness play a fundamental role because rationality is not enough anymore. And so we have the ethical dimension, which is pretty plain. So a reasonable citizen should accept reciprocity constraints. Therefore, he should be proved to be willing to abide by fair terms of cooperation and respect the others as free and equal. And the epistemic dimension, that's the one I care about right now, is, well, first of all, accept the burden of judgment. So in a way, the epistemic non-ideal circumstances I explained before, and also this is the part I think is really relevant, respect the epistemic authority of the other agent. And what does it mean to respect the authority of the other agent? It means that a reasonable citizen should be able to restrain himself or herself from trying to impose her private perspectives when publicly deliberating over political matters. And this is important for getting to the public reason constraint. So political reasonableness implies two constraints that should be respect. The first one is the reciprocity constraint. So agents are willing to publicly discuss fair terms of cooperation because they have a sense of justice and are motivated by it. And of course, there are theories that the sense of justice can be interpreted in a very minimal political way, or can imply a more perfectionist view of liberalism, but that is not important, not relevant now. The public reason constraint implies that citizens are able to accept the burden of judgment, and they have good reason for abiding by a general norm of epistemic modesty and for mutually respecting each other as both moral and epistemic authorities. Okay, so granted the fact that we cannot solve disagreement, and that it is really hard to appeal to a third perspective authorities that can, solve the disagreement, because any appeal to an authority is going to be debatable again, right? We don't have a public argument to solve disagreement appealing to an external authority. Then what's the conclusion for a reasonable citizen is like he can stick with his own guns, but he supposedly are not, he will keep respect the other position. Like even if he doesn't agree with it, he will tolerate the other position, and he will abide by a general ethos of epistemic modesty. That's pretty much what I believe political reasonableness at the epistemic level does. Okay, so this is like, I'm just spelling out the argument. So the idea is that acknowledging that political deliberation starts from genuine disagreement instead of from agreement, as I told you before. And this implies, again, that agents that understand this notion of disagreement are able to abide by an attitude of intellectual modesty while deliberating over public matters. Okay, and this gets us to the epistemology of disagreement. So as everybody knows in this room, is the idea how people react to the fact to disagree with our peers of them. And I believe that, in politics, we are, and granted the non-ideal circumstances, I'm not talking about epistemic peerhood like, in the epistemic, traditional sense, like we have full information, we have this sort of the same level of epistemic abilities. The idea is like, well, any person can vote, so everybody's recognized a sort of epistemic authority. If you think about it, the idea is the people wrote the Constitution, so everybody shared the epistemic authority in writing the Constitution, ideally, of course. But the notion is everybody, the lay person and the expert, are sharing epistemic authority while deliberating over political matters that have an impact on everybody's life. And so there are epistemic reasons to prompt citizens to be reasonable, okay? So reasonableness introduces both moral and epistemic notions inside the political context, and I feel that looking at the epistemology of disagreement is really helpful to see that there are epistemic normative reasons for citizens while deliberating and being in disagreement with others. So citizens have sound epistemic reason for mutually recognizing each other as putative epistemic authority, okay? And short notes, the authority is strictly dependent on very differentiated doxastic system of beliefs, because as I claimed before, there is no way to solve disagreements, and the agent-mediated perspectives can never be brackets. So we are always respecting the doxastic perspective of somebody, given the fact that this person is, using these perspectives inside the connection of politics. And so reasonable citizens will abstain from appealing to P and or not P in case in which there is a reasonable disagreement between P and not P at the public level, okay? So it's like, if we had to build a bridge and an engineer and a layperson came, we're gonna listen to the engineer and build the bridge according to his calculus, right? We're gonna say, okay, recognize the epistemic authority of this person. But when we are debating about an evaluative matter, and there are two different comprehensive doctrines, and they have opposite, position, what the public reason constraint imposed on us is to using just public reason, okay? To don't appeal to private reason, like P and no P, because they are not gonna be intelligible for the others members of the society, or they might be intelligible but not accessible to them because they have a completely different doxastic perspective. So the idea is that a reasonable person is able to prevent herself from using her personal comprehensive doctrine and just use public reason, okay? This is a high demand, and it's really hard to, abide by this constraint, but I think that's more or less the idea that Rawls has in mind in the last, paper he wrote. And so, what does it mean to share epistemic authority? So, since reasonable disagreement is genuine, we are justified in adopting a steadfast attitude towards our beliefs. It's not that we have to, change our belief just because, or diminish our, credibility in our belief just because we happen to disagree with somebody else. But on the same time, what really is important at the political level to not make the conflict even worse than it already is we are not entitled to dismiss the other party as an epistemical inferior agent, right? So we have to abide by a symmetric credibility constraint and therefore respect a sort of mutual accountability. So we have a symmetric obligation to acknowledge the other as a potential epistemic authority. And therefore we have to recognize the fact that we owe them some sort of response, and we have to be tolerant of the view of the others we do not agree with, okay? And as you probably know, like in politics, at the end of the day, when conflict is not solvable, well, toleration is what does much of the work, right? We sort of tolerate the other position as long as, nobody's harmed, and when somebody's harmed, then, there is jail. So, so from the sharing epistemic authority means that reasonable citizens will be able to be intellectually modest and will sort of get into a democratic epistemic ethos in which, again, we accept the mutual accountability in which we all the others are recognition and respect, notwithstanding the fact that we completely disagree with them about their, conception of the good, for example, or about which is the most important political value we have to look for in politics. And, okay. And okay, this is pretty much my interpretation of Rawls and my specific, analysis of epistemic reasonableness. And now I want to introduce you two critiques that has been raised against this epistemic notion of reasonableness. The first one is by Martha Nussbaum, and Nussbaum believes, she argues that we have to let go any epistemic reading of reasonableness. Why so? Because she believes, Nussbaum, that if we try to, evaluate the comprehensive doctrines to the standards of reasonableness, well, we're going to end up having like a perfectionist view or liberal view, right? So we try to teach people how to live a good life in a way. So she believes we have to stick just with the ethical readings of reasonableness, and that's enough in the social, in the social and political world. As long as we recognize the fair terms of cooperation and we respect people as free and equal, we don't need all the discussion and debate about epistemic disagreement. It's fine. Just let's go with the ethical aspect. The other critique is from the other side of the spectrum. It was raised by Stephen Wall, and Wall actually he claims that the epistemic notion of reasonableness is really important, but is important for a different reason from the one I defend, because he believes that he defends a perfectionist liberal view, and he believes that we have to look for an idealized view of human rationality. And in this regard, he believes that most of the Rawlsian tradition has abandoned a look for a solid justification because they actually have tried to look for an actual consent theory. So that's what was Alex told us yesterday a little bit. So the idea is that you can look for the best argument possible for justifying a liberal theory, or justifying principle of justice, or we can actually look at which are the practices for getting an actual consent of citizens, legitimating a conception. And according to Wall, the Rawlsian tradition, it just looked too much on the political side of things and not enough on the idea rational human beings justificatory process. And so Rawls defend an externalist view on reasons, and so he tried to find reasons that no one can reasonably reject if he acts according to the high ideal standard of rational and reasonableness. So Wall also defend a specific idea of respect for the individuals, according to which we have to look for the ideal rational capacity that we are able to share as human beings. And so I respect you when I try to make you see the reason you should accept, because you cannot reasonably reject them. Okay, this is the way in which I can really respect you. So the idea, we can solve disagreement, because if all of us really reasons as ideally reasonable citizens, we can all agree on the best solution and the best concept, because that's the one that, ideally is perfectly justified. Okay, so this is a completely different notion. I mean, it's extremely interesting, but different. So my reply to Nussbaum is this one. I distinguish, and here Rawls is not really clear, I don't think also the literature. You can apply the standard of reasonableness to qualify 3 different subjects. There are the citizens that can be reasonable or unreasonable, the comprehensive doctrine they hold, and also disagreement. You can specify disagreement as reasonable, and pretty much a reasonable disagreement is what is usually called qualified disagreement. So for Nussbaum, what is problematic is using reasonableness to assess comprehensive doctrines. And I think she is completely right, because I think that we should use reasonableness just to qualify the attitude of the citizens, not the comprehensive doctrine they hold, because it doesn't matter really. I mean, some comprehensive doctrines are not going to be, compatible with the liberal spectrum. But still, the trouble is dealing with who hold these doctrines. There's not much the problem about the doctrine themselves. And so we can say that, first of all, a notion of comprehensive doctrine is quite loose. Not every doctrine is comprehensive in the same degree, and not every agent holds the private comprehensive doctrine with the same strength, right? I mean, somebody can have a loose comprehensive doctrine and sometimes following it, sometimes, be able to, get a trade-off with some other principles. But also, you can have the same comprehensive doctrine can be held in a very reasonable way or in a completely illiberal, fanatic way, right? So I think what is really important is to look at the attitude of the comprehensive doctrine holders rather than debate about which doctrines are reasonable and which are not, okay? And I think Rawls believe that we can actually assess the comprehensive doctrines as well, and I think this is like, the wrong move, because the respect we owe people as citizens, as members of the society, is to look at their attitude and respect them regardless of which comprehensive doctrine they hold. And the solution, I think, is important for catching what Nussbaum believes is wrong about the comprehensive doctrine assessment, is that we can distinguish between a politically reasonable attitude and the philosophically reasonable comprehensive doctrine. So we can have a philosophical analysis about which doctrine are reasonable or not. But when we are debating about politics, what is really relevant is the political reasonable attitude of the citizens. So we, we distinguish completely between these 2 different goals. And so if we look at the political reasonable attitude, we can, reply to Nussbaum and still keep the epistemic dimension of reasonableness, okay? So I think she's right, her diagnosis is right, but her solution is too strong, because I think we have to keep the epistemic dimension as well. And now the reply to Wall. So as I claim, he defends an ideal standard of rationality, and we have to respect persons for what they should be and for the reason they should have, okay? We have to show them the good external reason they have to abide to be actually to meet the standard of rationality. And this is like a very different, notion of respect from the one I defend, and I think it's really interesting, but at the end of the day, I don't think it can do much of the normative work, at least at the political level. I'm not talking about the moral ones, but at the political level, I think this notion of respect is try to do too much. And to show this, I just mentioned the famous distinguish between two kinds of respect by Stephen Dorwell. So the first one is the recognition respect, and according to Dorwell, recognition respect is attributed in virtue of the recognition of others as person. You just walk down the street, you look at somebody, and you just recognize him or her like as a fellow human being, right? And you just don't push him or her into the street. So the recognition respect is ascribed by default. It is a priori, unconditional, and it doesn't meet degree, okay? It's not, it's either you give recognition respect or you don't, okay? It doesn't come in degrees. By contrary, the appraisal respect is expressed the positive consideration or esteem you have in a person or you don't have in a person. It's a posteriori, conditional on actual conduct and comes in degrees. So you can, you can have appraisal respect for a friend or a member of your family and acknowledge him or her, not just because you recognize her as a human being, but also because you claim, well, she's a very good human being, intellectually speaking, she's really interesting, and so you evaluate this person's, abilities, attitudes, and characters. And of course, naturally, in our intersubject relationship, both these kind of respects are really, really important. Okay, it makes total sense. But my argument, and it's not just mine, of course, the idea is that in politics, and especially when we look at the power and structural relationship between political institutions and citizens, we have to. What is really important is the recognition respect. Okay, because in the political domain, we can have what is called an opacity respect. So the idea is that institutions should treat citizens as opaque, okay? It's not so much that we have to engage in an appraisal of the citizens' personal merits, faults, epistemic virtues, morality, standards of rationality they meet, like we all believe we should. The idea is that, we just are fellow citizens, we share moral and epistemic authority, and we should treat each other with recognition respect. At least in the political arena, okay? When we have, a beer night, the appraisal respect is what is relevant. But, when we are, in the booth casting our vote and talking about constitutions, well, we need each other to, prevent analysis of our morality and epistemic abilities, and we try to treat each other as opaque, okay? And this is like respectful in the baseline sense, because I don't want to engage in evaluating you. I just respect you. That's it. I mean, a priori, okay? And I think that if we can, argue in favor of the opacity respect in a strong way, well, we can have a reply to Wall claiming, well, it's true, the epistemic dimension is really relevant, but your notion of respect, as long as it's really interesting, is implied too much, okay? It will mean that, we have to wonder how much people spend time reasoning and how far away they are from the ideal of standard rationality, and well, from the institutional perspective, that's really too much. Okay, so, and now the last strength of my analysis. So I want to argue that we can look at a specific epistemic dimension of political equality, starting from my notion of opacity respect. Okay, so given the non-ideal epistemic circumstances of politics, we can have a normative premise of democracy to grant equal respect that have derives from both normative, from moral and epistemic reasons. Okay, so the moral reason being that every political agent should be treated as on equal footing and seen as capable of reasoning powers, okay? And that's pretty, standard. But we also have an epistemic reason. So participants in a collective decision-making process should acknowledge each other for granted the symmetric recognition constraint. We have to recognize each other the status of epistemic peer, okay? In a very basic way, right? Again, we are talking about non-ideal epistemic circumstances, so the idea is like, we cannot, nobody can grant a higher epistemic authority, therefore we can, believe that everybody is like an epistemic peer, okay? And so, political epistemic peers. So, democratic societies are characterized by qualified deep disagreement, okay? I hold P and Amy hold not P, and we don't have, and both of us, argue we have epistemic good reason, and there is not a non-doxastic authority is not available, or anyway not publicly justifiable to decide who is right between me and Amy. And so we prevent ourselves from using P and non-P in the public domain, and we use public reasons, and we, keep aside the disagreement on that. That's pretty much the idea. And so agents are justified in keeping their own beliefs, but not entitled to dismiss the other parties as epistemic inferior. And that's, again, it's the standard of epistemic modesty. Therefore, I believe, and that's what catches the notion of political equality from the epistemic perspective, I think, is the idea that citizens have normative and epistemic reasons to reciprocally acknowledge one another as epistemic peers. And here I give like a really light criterion of epistemic peerhood, and I don't know if it makes sense, so any comments would be really, really helpful. So I say that someone you take to be equally likely to make a mistake, granted the fallibilistic perspectives, like, of the epistemic non-ideal circumstances, can be called an epistemic peer, or at least treated as an epistemic peer. And of course, this fallibilistic account on epistemic peerhood is a very light criterion that meets the actual epistemic circumstances of politics. And so finally, the epistemic dimension of political equality. Okay, grant to everybody the default position of equal respect without first requiring the demos to assess the actual cognitive, moral, and practical abilities of its citizens. And this is like, is respect the opacity constraint, right? So as institutions and as citizens deliberating over political matters, we restrain from an analysis of an appraisal of your abilities, quality, and flaws, and we just say, okay, we are peers, we are trying to decide together how, deliberate over political matters that that we impose on everybody else, and so we have to respect this opacity requirement, and granted that individuals reach a minimal threshold of epistemic capacities, because of course, if you don't reach a minimal threshold, you're actually not allowed to vote anyway. So the idea is like, granted that you reach this minimal threshold, then there is a normative requirement of avoiding any assessment of the specific epistemic capacity of each member of the constituency. And so we have this notion of political equality. Citizens are free and equal and should be recognized as so for the ethical dimension of reasonableness, and they have equal dignity and value, but also citizens should be acknowledge each other, and this is mutual, it should be symmetrically mutual. They should recognize each other as epistemic peers, and finally, they share practical and epistemic authority, and not just the practical one, like in the more mainstream analysis of reasonableness. Thank you.